All right, so today we're going to be talking about chapter 25, section 2, and it's called The War for Europe and North Africa. And so as we're looking at this stuff today, we're going to talk about the massive undertaking of 26 allied nations to defeat authoritarian governments around the world in the name of democracy and freedom and all of those just powerful fundamental principles that we believe in as a democratic country. And so, of course, we're battling the Axis powers, not only for control of Europe and North Africa, but also the Pacific, and those things we'll talk about more tomorrow. But for now, we're going to focus in on Europe and North Africa. And so I wanted to start by showing you guys this photograph. This is columns of Nazi soldiers marching through Berlin, tens of thousands of them, to mark the surrender of France in 1940. So by 1940, the invasion of Britain has been called off. The invasion of Britain is underway, and the Nazis have not yet invaded Russia. In fact, they've not yet been defeated anywhere. They've conquered Northern Europe. They've conquered Western Europe. They've conquered everywhere with the one exception of Great Britain. And so at this point in the war, things were looking rather bleak. But now, even before Pearl Harbor, the United States and Great Britain had agreed to a joint declaration of war aims. And so after Pearl Harbor, the United States is now formally declared war on Germany, on Japan, on Italy. And we agreed with Great Britain that the first place to attack was going to have to be against the Nazis. That we have to make sure that Great Britain stands. But the first task in this war is to get those 15 million people across the Atlantic Ocean safely. And meanwhile, the Nazis have submarine groups in coordination with scout planes with ranges of 1,000 miles that can take off from aircraft carriers. And they are specifically targeting these convoys full of soldiers. Every boat full of soldiers they can sink is a group of soldiers they don't have to fight. Every single one of these convoys that they can sink is a group of supplies, tanks, guns, food that cannot be used against them. And so, of course, this was the first major battle in the war for us, is the Battle of the Atlantic. And so we began to, of course, escort these convoys with destroyers. Destroyers are huge warships, just one class below aircraft carriers. And these ships are equipped with radar and sonar. Radar to detect scout planes, sonar which can see, in a manner of speaking, underwater to detect the U-boats. And so, for example, here's a photograph of a German U-boat exploding. And this photograph was taken off of the deck of one of these U.S. destroyers. And so it's very likely that the torpedo that sunk this ship was launched from the very boat that you're seeing here. And it's also likely that the sonar equipped on this destroyer is what detected the U-boat, which was attempting to sink them. And then also, if you look in the background of this photograph, there's an entire convoy of U.S. ships loaded with soldiers, with supplies, with weapons, that need to get to Europe safely. So I want to look at a map here of just kind of what's happening 1941, 1942. So by this point, as you can see, all of Western Europe is under control of the Nazis. All of the North European countries. The only country to remain neutral, in fact, in this part of the world is Switzerland. You can see them here in the middle. But yes, France has fallen. Most of Eastern Europe even has fallen, because by 1941, the Germans invaded Russia. And of course, we talked about this a while back, that the invasion of Russia was connected to the need for oil. And so many of these oil reserves are in the Ural Mountains around the city of Stalingrad. So if you look here on the map, you can see Stalingrad is one of these large cities where many of the major battles in the Second World War were fought. And so, as we're looking here, you can see a video playing in the background, and this is from Enemy at the Gates. And this follows the battle at Stalingrad. One of the largest battles in the entire Second World War was fought in Russia. Now, the Germans took this city, and they held it for many months. And in this bitter struggle to retake and hold what was left of the city, I mean, most of the city was in rubble, but it was in a strategic location because it protected these oil reserves that the Nazis needed to continue their campaign of conquest. And so they're actually in the Caucasus Mountains, where these oil reserves and oil fields are. And so in this bitter conflict, 1.1 million Russians died defending this city. And so this movie stars Jude Law, and you can see his character here has been conscripted, meaning he was drafted into the battle. He was actually loaded up onto a train car. They locked them in there. They taught them briefly how to use guns. They only had enough guns for about half of these soldiers. His character was supposed to follow someone with a gun. As you can see, as he's dying here, Jude Law grabs the gun, and then he's expected to continue fighting. Now, in this scene, all of these soldiers are going to die. The few that remain and try to run away are shot by their own men. The Soviets were determined to retake this city regardless of the losses. And so, in the end, this battle proved to be the turning point of the entire Second World War, because the Germans could not take and hold this city. They could not get these oil reserves that they so desperately had to have. And so 400,000 Germans were captured in this city at the end of the battle. And the Russians would use this battle to launch a counteroffensive that would eventually result in the invasion of Berlin. And so the turning point of the war happened in Stalingrad. Now, meanwhile, the United States again focused on making sure Great Britain survives. So we coordinated with the British Army to land our first troops in North Africa. The Nazis had control of the entire Mediterranean Sea in combination with the Italians. And so we had to take North Africa to give a safe point to land our troops to cross the Mediterranean and invade into Italy. And so Dwight D. Eisenhower, in collaboration with General Montgomery of the British Army, defeated the famous general of the Nazis, Erwin Rommel. In fact, it was in these battles that for the very first time, the Turing code-breaking machine was used. We knew where the Germans were going to be, and so we were able to outsmart them. So meanwhile, we've defeated Rommel. We are now ready to advance across the Mediterranean into Italy. And by 1944, Italy had been captured, Mussolini had been forced to resign, and we have now begun an invasion of Germany from the south. So there were many decorated people. In fact, one of the most highly decorated air units were the Tuskegee Airmen, a group of African-American pilots. In fact, I think a movie was just made about them recently. Many Mexican-American soldiers won several awards. In fact, when we go to D.C. And we stand outside the Pentagon, there's a famous statue of the flag raising at Iwo Jima. And you'll see these 6 Marines, have been captured by this photograph of raising the flag, and a famous statue was made outside the Pentagon to it. One of those men was Ira Hayes, a Mexican-American immigrant who joined the war, one of those 300,000 Mexican-Americans who fought, and he became really famous when he was one of these flag raisers at Iwo Jima. In fact, a Japanese-American unit was one of the most decorated units in American history. Remember, there were only 33,000 Japanese Americans that fought, and then here these folks served with great distinction. And so here you can see a photograph of Allied soldiers, American soldiers, landing in Italy in 1943. And of course, this sets the stage for D-Day. We had to take out the Italians. We had to pressure the Germans here. It was also essential that the Russians defeat the Germans in the Eastern Front to set the stage, because had the Nazis been able to concentrate their entire might on the Normandy beaches, D-Day never would have worked. And also, even with the pressure from the south and the east, it was still important to confuse the Germans and to make them think that we were going from a different point of view. And so General Patton was put in command of a fake army in northern England. And the point of that was to make the Germans think that we were going to land in the northern part of England instead of where we did in the southern part. And so, of course, Operation Overlord, codenamed D-Day, took place on June 6th of 1944. And I've got lots of cool stuff here to show you. So the general commander of the American Army, Omar Bradley, was overseeing the U.S. Army's role in this invasion. General George Patton led the Third Army and was key in liberating Paris and for even liberating the 101st Airborne. We'll talk about that a little later. But for now, I want to talk about D-Day. So before the invasion began, it was the job of the U.S. Air Force to fly over and to drop paratroopers behind enemy lines the night before, and also to bombard many of these gun sites and bunkers. And so this is a B-24. This is what Murray Gettleman flew in. And here you can see a cross-section of it. You can see all the different gunners and pilots. He was a radio operator. You can see the payload of bombs and the fuel reserves. I mean, these were nicknamed the Flying Fortress. And so next here, I want to look at a cross-section of the battle. And so as we zoom in, you can see the different beachheads. In fact, there were 4 different beachheads. The first 2 you'll see the landings of at Omaha and Utah beaches. But you can also see from what's happening here that the night before, glider planes and paratroopers were dropping behind enemy lines all around the Normandy beaches. Their job was to take out these artillery emplacements, to take out the bunkers that were going to be firing on U.S. troops as they land on these beaches. Now, many of these paratroopers got scattered all over. They were connecting with random different units, and many of them still managed to accomplish. Well, at 6:30 a.m. on June 6th, the first men stepped onto the beaches. And the heaviest casualties were met at Utah and Omaha beaches, where these landings occurred. By the end of the day, we have 150,000 men on these beaches. And I want to zoom in to show you what one of these looked like. And so here we're going to zoom in and look at Gold Beach. You can see there were barricades and barriers, even sunken ships in the harbor. Everything the Nazis could do to prevent troops from landing. And in the next scene, I'm going to show you how once they've landed, just the impossible conditions they had to endure to be able to cross the beach and climb the cliffs and take out these machine gun nests to save people. There were over 3,000 U.S. soldiers that died in this one day. It was called Operation Overlord. And so I've got a great clip here to show you of what it looked like from the soldier's perspective.
More than 70,000 American troops are about to invade German-held France. Over 1,000 will die on the first day, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over 5,000 ships and 10,000 aircraft are involved in the first wave alone. 5 beaches will be stormed. The most infamous is codenamed Omaha Beach.
Think about Omaha Beach from the standpoint of the young man, the ramp is about to drop, and the sights and the sounds all around provide the context of hell.
The first troops on Omaha Beach meet ferocious German resistance. Rocket launchers, mortars, and 85 machine gun nests tear into the Americans. There were meant to be 32 tanks with them, but 27 sink. The men are left with virtually no cover on the beach. William Dabney is totally exposed. Tethered to his barrage balloon, he's defenseless. When it's shot down, he has his chance. Like every other soldier on Omaha Beach, black or white, Dabney's mission now is to survive.
There wasn't any segregation there.
Harold Baumgarten is thrown straight into the carnage.
They were men with guts hanging out of their wounds and body parts lying along our path. Body parts lying along our path.
Some men were simply overwhelmed by the hell they met. By 9 a.m., almost 5,000 men are ashore. There are more than 2,000 U.S. casualties on Omaha Beach alone. William Dabney survives. He is later awarded the Legion of Honor. Operation Overlord is a logistical miracle, but the cost is staggering. Nearly 126,000 Americans are killed, wounded, or go missing during the Battle of Normandy. Harold Baumgarten is hit 5 times. After losing blood for over 30 hours, Baumgarten is brought back from the dead by a plasma transfusion, then injections of penicillin and morphine. The very supplies America has mass-produced to keep its men alive. D-Day is key to Hitler's defeat.
And so here you can also see an overview of these hundreds of thousands of American soldiers landing on these 5 different parts of the beaches of Normandy in France, supported by the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy, and also the 101st Airborne that have dropped the night before, doing their best to take out these gun emplacements. But it was codenamed Operation Overlord because the idea was to overwhelm the enemy. These soldiers actually trained in Middle Tennessee on the cliffs around Burgess Falls State Park. They would climb these cliffs because they were just the right pitch to be able to climb to simulate the conditions that they would have to endure under fire. And the significance of this was just incredible. France was liberated from 4 years of Nazi occupation. The very nation that made it possible for us to succeed in the American Revolution has now been liberated by the United States. And so here's a historic photograph of American soldiers going through the Arc de Triomphe, which has always been just a symbolic marker of France's importance and power in history. Of course, the Germans took their photographs of the Nazi troops marching through the Arc de Triomphe. Here's the Americans going through, liberating. And so now, the Germans are not only assaulted from Russia and from Italy, but now also from France. And so completely surrounded. It's a matter of time before the Nazis fall to the Allies. But time is what Hitler was hoping to buy. And it didn't matter what it cost. In fact, he sent out everything, all his tanks, all his armies against the Allies from all directions. It was called the Battle of the Bulge. It's the largest tank battle in the history of warfare. And it was an Allied victory. And after the Battle of the Bulge, it's a matter of time before the Allies take Germany. But the Nazis, Hitler was going to make sure that Germany fought to the death. He wanted all Germans to fight to the death. Because he continued to hope until the end, that some type of technological breakthrough would allow the Nazis to win. His top scientist, von Braun, the very man who's going to head the NASA program after World War II, was working on rockets. And he came up with the earliest rocket technology, and he was also working with other scientists on weapons of mass destruction. Of course, you know the story of Einstein, and we'll get to that later, and how he defected to the United States and began to work on the Manhattan Project. But the Nazis continued to work on these weapons of mass destruction until the very end. But it was the Russians who began to liberate the first death camps. Remember, the death camps were all in Poland, and when the Russians retook Poland and they came through, they found evidence of just killing on a scale that we had never seen before. But now with France liberated, with Eastern Europe retaken by the Soviets, Germany is under attack. The first town taken by the Americans was the town of Aachen, but the Soviets would beat us to Berlin. And at the cost of 250,000 lives, the Soviets took the city of Berlin. Hitler, meanwhile, was in a bunker in the middle of the city. It was a massively fortified building, impregnable to bombs. We were flying over it constantly, dropping bombs. The Russians were just blowing this thing to smithereens, and it withstood all bombardment. So with no choice left, the Russian infantry went into the city and fought street to street. And street to street, they had to take the city until, and before we get to Hitler's death, I wanted to show you just kind of on a large scale what's happening here, is that you have the Soviets coming in from the east, the Americans and the British coming in from the west, also from the south. So Germany's being assaulted at all points. And yet still the Nazis held on because, I can only assume they were hoping for some technology that would lead to a swift victory from the midst of defeat. So here's a convoy of Allied troops going through a German village in April of 1945, so close to the end of the war, because in that same month, as the Soviet army was storming Berlin, Hitler married his mistress, Eva Braun, deep in this bunker. She drank poison, he shot himself, their bodies were burned, and the rest of the German high command surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers on May 8th of 1945, and we celebrate that today as VE Day, or the victory in Europe. Now, tragically, less than a month before Hitler's death, Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away on April 12th of the same year, and his vice president, Harry S. Truman, became president. We'll talk about him more with the war in the Pacific in the next lesson.